So neither of the candidates is talking a lot about federalism. Why are we talking about federalism in the context of this campaign?
I think we're talking about federalism because the central issue in this campaign is the health of the economy, both jobs in the near term and retooling the economy in the long haul in the aftermath of this recession. And if we're going to talk about the economy, we've got to talk about the role of government. And in our country, power is diffused across multi-layers of government. We are a federal republic. We're not Britain. We're not waiting for the rules to flow down from some central government distant from the people. We are a collection of the federal government and powerful states and very powerful cities and metropolitan areas. So if we really want to have a conversation about how the public sector sets a platform for private sector growth, job creation, private sector investment, a restructuring of the economy towards production, towards innovation in the aftermath of this recession, we better talk about how the next president galvanizes the talents and energies of our cities and metropolitan areas and our states, government leaders, but also private, and leverages up their possibilities and their potential. At the end of the day, the president is not the CEO of the federal government, even though they seem to act like that all the time. They are the leader of a nation, and they need to understand, as they think about and as they talk about economic growth, economic prosperity, in all of its different forms, tapping the possibilities of real collaboration between the federal government, states, cities, and metros is the path to success.
And when you say that the president is not the CEO of the country or of the government, you know, both Obama and Romney in very different ways talk about it as though that's what they are or what they aspire to be. So Romney talks about himself as sort of a Mr. Fix-It who comes into failing institutions and rebuilds them and makes them work. And Obama, you know, talks about the strong actions that he has taken since 2009 to stabilize the economy. You're suggesting a very different model of the way we should think about this, and I'm just asking, sort of as a preliminary matter, sketch it out. How you know, what is the platform that we should be thinking about here?
So let's think about where the economy is actually located for a second, because it's not located in Washington, D.C., right? It's just a set of government agencies here, though it has its own particular distinctive economy in the metro. The U.S. essentially is a network of cities and metropolitan areas from an economic perspective. That's the spatial geography of the economy. The top 100 metropolitan areas, with a population generally above 500,000 people, are about 2/3 of our population. They're 3/4 of our GDP. And on every single asset that's going to matter in this century, human capital, infrastructure, the sectors and the clusters that are going to enable us to produce advanced goods and advanced services that we can sell abroad, they are disproportionately located in these top 100 metropolitan areas. So economically, we're a metropolitan nation. Politically, we're a union of states and a federal government. An enormous amount of power, resource power, regulatory power is nested in the 50 states and these cities and metropolitan areas. So if the federal government and the next president is going to think about how to alter federal rules, federal programs, federal investments, the federal tax system to leverage up private sector growth, they better be thinking about how they do that in tandem, A, with the places that are actually driving the economy, cities and metropolitan areas, and B, with their partners in government, the states, the cities, and the metropolitan areas. I think it's a peculiar American kind of defect, in a sense, to separate out all these different layers of our federal republic as if they have nothing to do with each other. When I go to other countries, there's a much more integrated conversation of how the national government relates to their equivalent of states, relates to their equivalent of cities and metropolitan areas. Maybe the U.S. is just so hyper-specialized and compartmentalized that we've removed ourselves from the possibilities of the whole operating in collaboration, operating in partnership.
So if we think about President Obama as, the leader of a nation, of a sort of an integrated set of governments and power nests, how would you describe the vision of federalism that his administration has presided over and cultivated over the last few years?
Well, I think he's had a fairly mixed vision of federalism. And on one hand, and I would say this is with regard to the education area, his not only vision of federalism, but the operation of federalism is somewhat consistent with where I think the next president needs to go. He set out clearly a major goal for the nation. We need an educated workforce. We need a skilled workforce to meet the demands of a very, very hyper-competitive century. And then he basically set out a series of national goals and signals from the federal government to the states and the cities. If you want to receive a certain segment of federal funding, here's how you're going to need to reform. The race to the top effort within the educational system. I think that's a smart federalism. In a hyper-competitive world, in a China world, whether it's regard with education, whether it's regard to advanced manufacturing, whether it's regard to exports and trade, I think the president has to set out a vision for the country and then literally say to the cities and the metropolitan areas in the states, if you want to compete for federal funding, you're going to have to put skin in the game, and you're going to have to reform your systems to align with this brutal competitive reality we face. He did that with education. I have to say, with regard to some other areas of domestic policy, he may have laid out a vision, let's double exports in 5 years, which he did back in the State of the Union in 2010, but he didn't quite operationalize it. He didn't quite say to the states and the cities and metros, okay, now that I've set out this vision, here's how you can work with the federal government to make that vision a reality. In fact, he set up all these councils, an export council, a jobs council, an advanced manufacturing partnership, and there was no governor and no mayor or no metropolitan business leader who even sat on those councils. So I think the education model I found consonant with the kind of competitive challenges and economic restructuring challenges we face as a country. If he could just apply that from the education realm to some of these critical elements of the next economy, including infrastructure, right? I think we may be getting somewhere.
Now, with education, you have a policy area that kind of lends itself to this, in the sense that the federal role in education is somewhat subordinate to particularly local governments, which actually run school systems, and state governments, which run big universities, right? And so it's sort of easy as a federal official to think about this in a very integrated way. But some of these other policy areas, like exports, or to a lesser extent, I suppose, infrastructure, where we do have this idea, that you fund infrastructure in the transportation bill right? That there's a very kind of top-down feel to some of that stuff. How do you do a vision like that in the context of policy areas that we have more expectation of a sort of dominant federal role?
Well, it's sort of interesting because the feds only spend about 7 cents on every dollar in the education realm. And yet they're having this outsized effect. Right? Because in a way what they're doing is they're looking at the past 20 years of reform in the states, in the cities, charter schools, competition, right? Teacher training, and they're trying to apply that up to the federal level through this competitive model. It's quite ironic in a way that given the fact that we have a much more shared role and shared responsibility for things like infrastructure, that the feds haven't had more of a national vision. A, they don't seem to have a clear vision on infrastructure, and B, haven't tried to shift the operations in a substantial way of how the feds, the states, and the private sector collaborate together to deliver a 21st century infrastructure. So I find it somewhat ironic, actually, that the federal role from a funding perspective is so small in education, and yet their impact on policy thinking is so large. And yet when we go to other areas where it's more shared between the federal government, the states, and now the cities and metros, what we have is something of a muddle. Now you can say that's partly due to partisanship and ideological polarization, but it's partly because I think we haven't thought hard enough about this interplay between the different layers of government and the private civic sectors for a long time. Our federalist thinking has atrophied. You know, in the 1970s, we used to have advisory councils, governors, cabinet secretaries, members of Congress would sit together and actually try to wrestle with the major issues of the day. No one really sits together except for photo ops today. So our federalist thinking has atrophied at the very time when we really do need to get these different layers of the machinery operating in an efficient and an effective way. The competitive realities in the world today are brutal. And to act as if the national government, by changing a couple levers, is going to ultimately restructure an economy as diverse and as complicated and sophisticated as ours is absurd. I mean, we really need to challenge the next administration, whoever wins this election, to think of themselves or to think of their remit as galvanizing the talents and energies of an entire nation, not just tinkering with federal rules and policies.
So unlike Obama, Romney and actually Republicans in general often do talk about federalism.
Right.
They don't usually use the word federalism, but they talk about the sort of they have a sort of an anti-Washington vocabulary and a 10th Amendment-oriented vocabulary, and Romney is certainly part of that, and I'm curious how that translates into a federalist vision of the type that you're talking about.
Well, Romney was a governor of Massachusetts. In fact, many of the things that Romney did when he was governor of Massachusetts have now scaled up to the federal level, which is a quintessential American kind of phenomenon. Healthcare, and even his focus on what used to be called smart growth, what is now called sustainable communities. When Romney was governor of Massachusetts, he set up this sort of super secretariat that combined transportation and housing and land use. He tried to move away from the compartmentalized responses and programs to a more integrated vision. And to some extent, that has also been copied and scaled up under the Obama administration. There used to be a time when Republicans would talk with some consistency and some clarity about returning power to the states, and by extension to the cities and metropolitan areas. Now it's a bit of a muddle, frankly. They do talk consistently about real federal power, frankly, with regard to social issues.
Right.
In some respects, they just want the federal government to control many of the social divisions and social issues that we're now wrestling with in the country, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's abortion rights and so forth. When it comes to the economy, frankly, it's hard to discern, frankly, what the plan is. Relatively recently, Romney was overheard saying that he might either dismantle, consolidate the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I used to be chief of staff at HUD. It's a $45 billion agency on the spending side. It has the Federal Housing Administration, which is about now a third of the mortgage market. You don't dismantle an agency like that easily without really thinking about how it might disrupt the housing market, particularly at a time when it's still very fragile and very vulnerable. So it's hard for me at times to discern what the model is now coming out of Romney with perspective to how he would organize the federal government to leverage up state, city, and metropolitan areas, and as important, more important, the private sector. So talking just off the cuff about we're going to get rid of HUD without really saying affirmatively, what's the plan then for federal, state, local, private integration about a healthy and robust mortgage market, healthy and robust housing sector? We haven't seen that plan yet. So I would say social issues, clear. It seems like they want more federal power coming out of the Republican nominee. With regard to the economy, not clear, frankly, as to how they see this interplay. And what I'm describing is the way the world works, which is a complicated, sophisticated mix between federal, state, and local power and private sector entrepreneurialism. That's the way our nation works. It's worked very well for us, but we're up against competitive threats, frankly, now that require us to be more thoughtful, more efficient about how we operate.
So the next administration, be it Obama 2 or Romney 1, comes in. What are a series of steps, substantive and rhetorical and bureaucratic, that they should take with an eye toward moving toward this vision of federalism, and stimulating that ground up blossoming of talent and harnessing of energy?
Do less better and cut to invest, from consumption to production. Those are big shifts. We're talking about big shifts in what the federal government does, but I think they'll serve these cities and metros and states well. Do a race to the top on what really matters: advanced manufacturing, advanced services, exports, innovation. And then engage the governors and the mayors and the metropolitan business leadership in helping design the next phase of our federal republic. At the end of the day, I think we're going through a big shift in American governance right now. We've really lost any sense of clarity or discipline or focus over the past 30 years. We're that big, we're that powerful, we didn't need to do it. But what's now needed in a China century, in a very disruptive period, is for us to literally get our act together. And that's not just the federal government, that's the whole republic. And I think, hard job, but that's what the person's elected to do. They are not elected to be the CEO of the federal government. They are not elected just to look under the hood and fix a bunch of broken agencies and broken programs. They're elected to lead. They're elected to set a vision and galvanize the talents and energies of an entire nation. We are basically formed to fit to that purpose. I mean, we are a federal republic where power is diffuse and power is shared. So let's get the leadership we deserve.
Bruce, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.